Mr. Speaker, I just want to point out that the reason that government has no problems with pandering to slum landlords is because they are slum landlords, Mr. Speaker. They have been slum landlords with our Housing New Zealand houses. And I want to remind Mr. Alfred Ngaro, because I'm sure he knows this, that just about every single case that comes through our electorate offices in West Auckland now are housing cases. I was in, like 4 years ago, as a list MP in Waitakere. We never had this number of housing issues like we do now. Just about every single one of them are people who cannot find a house, or they are in homes who are making them sick. Now, and thank you, Nick Smith, for being responsible for all of those people that are coming to us with letters from their GPs, letters from their hospitals, pointing out the fact that they must be provided with healthy housing because their children are getting sick. And I just want to point out to that slum landlord over there that actually I think it's disgusting, following on from the Emilita Bourne case, that government is still not keeping a record of the number of people who are putting in for transfers for Housing New Zealand houses because of the fact that their children have health issues due to the conditions that they're living in. We asked how many transfers had been put in for that reason. The government said, following on from Emilita Bourne, that they are not collecting that information. Well, they should be collecting that information. Today we're talking about private rentals, but let's just looking at this really is a reflection of what we're being provided with by the government. Mr. Speaker, recently I had a mother contact me whose 4-year-old was in the hospital with respiratory problems, and she was going to be released because of the fact that at Waitakere Hospital there were too many people in there. The hospital couldn't provide everyone with a bed, so they said, look, we'd like to keep her in, but we can't. She's going to have to go home. That mother was so scared because she knew that as soon as she got home to that house that had dampness problems, that had black mould all over it, that as soon as she got home, that child would get sick again and she would be back in the hospital. Well, she went home on the Thursday, she was back in the hospital on the Saturday. So I'm going to point out to Mr. Smith that actually this bill doesn't go far enough. And this is typical of the national government, as my colleague Phil Twyford has pointed out. They do just enough to look like they are doing something. It forces us to have to vote for it, but it is not enough. And it does not address the problem that we're facing in this country. Mr. Speaker, I've had tenants come to me who are living in leaky buildings. They are living in leaky buildings in West Auckland that have been bought by landlords, bought for cheap because no one wants to buy them, but the landlords buy them knowing that they can still rent them out for market rentals. And it's disgusting. These people living in these houses, I've had cases of rheumatic fever. I've had numerous cases of where children never had asthma or respiratory problems until they were living in these homes. And these are the types of landlords that minister should be trying to legislate against. That minister should be doing something in relation to that, but he's not. So the fact that a landlord or a person can purchase a leaky building and rent it out for a market rent because we have such a demand for housing, people are desperate and they will take whatever they can get. And do you know who ends up in these houses? It's our poorest families. Our families that are not first in line to be able to get the healthier homes, the nicer rental homes, Mr. Smith. They're the ones that end up in these unhealthy homes. So that minister and that government should be ashamed of themselves, Mr. Speaker. My colleague, Phil Twyford, who's working in West Auckland as the Te Atatū MP, like me, has seen so many cases come through the door where we have landlords who aren't acting in an ethical way and who do need to be held to account by responsible legislation, Mr. Speaker. And I'm going to share another example of an irresponsible landlord, and that's one who has 3 houses on the same street, is renting out rooms to people who are on parole, also people who have mental health conditions, who find it difficult to get housing elsewhere. But the housing that they're in is not only unhealthy, Mr. Speaker, but it's causing problems in terms of the number of people that are being squeezed into those homes. It's causing problems for that whole street, that whole neighbourhood, Mr. Speaker. And I wish that the national government had the courage to do something, to go a little bit further than what they've gone in here. Mr. Speaker, sadly, this policy is the kind of grudging half measure that's become the trademark of the National's housing policy, but not just the National Party's housing policy, also their social development policy, their education policy. In relation to their social development policy, I can refer to the so-called Supporting Children in Hardship Bill that really did very little to address the issue we have with 305,000 children living in poverty. Instead, Mr. Speaker, it was an attempt to make it look like they were doing something. As I said, this government has no courage to make the bold decisions, and National simply has no real commitment to housing reform and standards. The government actually should have voted for Phil Twyford's Healthy Homes Guarantee Bill earlier this year, but they didn't. And instead of the bill we're debating today, which is a weak half measure, they should actually vote for Andrew Little's Healthy Homes Guarantee Bill, which will be debated in early 2016. And that's Labor's bill, which will see standards for both insulation and heating. I don't know how National Government MPs live with themselves on a daily basis, particularly those ones who are electorate MPs or even list MPs based in poorer areas, knowing the very real reality that our poorer families especially are facing out there and the implications that that's having for their children. And Mr. Speaker, I want to point out that at the moment we're talking predominantly about the health issues in relation to children, but actually with a growing number of New Zealanders not being in their own homes, a growing number of New Zealanders being forced to rent, in particular looking at our senior citizens who are going into retirement without owning homes. This is a very real issue for them too. Respiratory problems amongst our senior citizens is a huge issue, and unless the government can lift the standards required in private rentals, then we're going to see not only children that are the direct victims of these types of housing environments and low living standards, but also our senior citizens who are going to be increasingly visiting our hospitals with respiratory problems because they are living in substandard rental accommodation, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there is a massive need to make rental properties warm and dry. Brand says only 22% of rental properties are in good condition, 44% are in poor condition, Mr. Speaker. And Nick Smith justifies his pandering to some landlords by saying that setting standards for heating and insulation would cost too much and push rents up. But a heat pump and insulation for a 3-bedroom home would cost around $5,000 and last 15 years. Over that time, a home would bring in more than $250,000 in rental income. It really is a small investment in an asset that generates a lot of revenue. And when we think about the cost of this, because listening to Mr. Smith earlier talking about the fact that Labor's measure, which was a full warrant of fitness for private rentals, couldn't be considered because it was not considered the most cost-effective mechanism for achieving the outcomes required. Well, how can it not be considered cost-effective when every day this low standard of private rentals is costing us lives? It's costing us admissions into hospitals, Mr. Speaker. It's costing us the health of New Zealanders, not just our children, but also our senior citizens and a whole lot of people that are living in mouldy, damp homes. So actually, Mr. Smith, perhaps there should be a conversation that goes on with our health minister, because I'm sure if they're able to reconcile what's happening in health and what's happening in housing, then they'll work out that the most cost-effective thing to do would be to implement a full warrant of fitness for private rentals, like Labor has suggested for a long time and will continue to do so. Thank you.